We're going to get started in about 90 seconds. Just give people an opportunity to grab a snack and have a seat, and we'll get going in 90 seconds. Well, welcome back, everybody. It's kind of funny, you know, I grew up in Washington, D.C. area. My family's from Appalachian, Western Maryland, in a coal mining Appalachian town, Kitzmiller, Maryland. But I grew up in the D.C. area, and I started doing this work mostly in, you know, the sort of the sort of upper Atlantic coast corridor. So D.C., Philadelphia, New York, Boston areas, you know, along the coast there. And what I noticed when I would go and do work in schools in those areas is that people would fill in the front first. Because if they wanted to yell at me, they wanted to make sure I could hear them very clearly. So they would stay and you know, if they were upset about something I was saying, they would say it loudly and they would stand up and they wanted to be right in the front. And then I moved to the Midwest. I lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. I taught at a little university called Hamline University in St. Paul for 5 years. And I noticed in the Midwest, always the front couple rows are empty and everyone fills in the back first. And it was like nobody would, I never had people standing up in the front row and confronting me. During the session, people would smile and nod and feel like everything's great. And then I would just hear them say mean things about me as I walked out to my car. In a session when I'm going to talk all about bias and stereotype, it's great to start by stereotyping my entire audience. I think that's a good start. I don't know. I'm in a giddy mood because my baby, her name's Maddie, 3.5 months old. She just got to the point. How many of you have kids? She got to the point where she had been doing these like one-syllable goos and ga's, and that was exciting in and of itself. But now she's like stringing together syllables. So I like snuck behind this. And my partner Jennifer is always sending me video. I feel like I need to show it to you now. I'm not going to show it to you, but I just snuck behind the stage and I saw little baby Maddie with the goos and the ga's, and now I'm in a good mood. And I feel like we should just go to brunch instead of talking about equity now. But okay. So a lot of that first part was sort of conceptual, institutional. A lot of what we're going to talk about here is more individual practice, individual reflection. I talked a lot about bias and that sort of thing. We're going to go through some exercises around that, talk a little bit more about that. We're going to talk about different ways of thinking about classroom practice from an equity lens and specifically about curriculum. And then I'm going to contradict everything I said about it being about ideology and not practice and share a few practices with you. But I want to just start. I wonder if anybody here has any questions or anything that's left over from that previous session, questions or thoughts or comments, maybe you don't want to share in front of everybody. Anyone share? Anybody? Yes? That's a great question. Okay. Yeah, the question there was, what's the best way to find out from students or parents what they might be feeling or experiencing? Because we may not know, and again, a lot of people, if they're feeling marginalized or whatever word we want to use, are not necessarily going to come and tell us that. I mean, I think a great way to do it, instead of thinking about that in terms of like in a moment, how do I do that? I think the goal is, how do I create relationships with students and families so that they feel comfortable talking to me about it? But then I can just ask. I mean, how are things going for you here? Do you feel comfortable when you come to visit the school? You can just ask, directly ask. And if they trust you, they'll be honest. I mean, certainly, I don't know, elementary kids want to please the teacher sometimes, so maybe they won't, But I think most parents, if I create an atmosphere where they feel comfortable communicating it, then they will communicate it. And usually, initially, they'll communicate it very kindly because they realize, y'all have a hard job and y'all are exhausted. But even if I'm not going to share something, your act of asking goes a long way. Because now I know you're tapped into the possibility that something might be challenging for me. So, any other questions? Okay, should we jump into the new stuff, the new PowerPoint? I'm thinking about trying to detox from PowerPoint. I'm like addicted to PowerPoint, and now I don't know how to do a presentation without the freaking PowerPoint. So I was thinking when I was on the flight here and doing some preparation, I was thinking, I wonder if I could do this without PowerPoint, and then I panicked and made a PowerPoint instead. So I want to start with this James Baldwin quote. Is anybody here willing to read this for us? I'll hold the mic for you. You can hold the mic. Will somebody read aloud this James Baldwin quote for us? Oh, thank you. You have to read it in your best James Baldwin voice.
What is it you want me to reconcile myself to? You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my niece's and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?
That was a good reading. Round of applause. You nailed it. Okay. So let's just start with this quote. James Baldwin, he's talking here about race, but we could apply this to class or any other dimension of diversity that we want to apply it to. Anybody who's writing today about diversity and inclusion and equity and that sort of thing, James Baldwin already wrote what they wrote just decades ago. So I really encourage you all to check him out if you haven't already. What does if you think about this in terms of the conversation we've been having today, what do you think he's challenging us to do here? What is he pushing us on here? What's the challenge he's setting forth? Anybody? This is what I get for asking very vague questions. Yes, please. Oh, interesting. I think I heard that right. The last part of that, why are you asking us to do the work that you ought to be doing? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely a piece of it for sure. One of the things I think about when I look at this quote is just in terms of my own personal commitment to anti-bias or diversity, inclusion, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter too much what you call it, matters more what we do. So I always think about, whose pace am I moving here? Whose pace am I moving forward? And again, when I think about what is my responsibility, I think, well, I need to be improving on this at the pace that the people who are most desperate for me to improve need me to improve. I always hear a lot about, when it comes to equity and diversity, sort of things, baby steps. And I think maybe I hear more about this at the elementary level, especially about how we work with kids. There's this growing body of research that talks about, for instance, at what point in life children of color start to recognize and experience racism. Does anybody want to guess what age that is? 10? Anyone else? 3 or 4? I think I heard a couple threes over here. It's 2 years old. 2 years old, they're already observing, they're already recognizing the racial bias their parents are experiencing if their parents are also people of color. They're already starting to recognize that. And I think especially for elementary, we might think we need to be age appropriate, and kids aren't, when we say, kids maybe aren't ready for this conversation or that conversation. When we say they're not ready, we have to ask ourselves, who are we talking about when we're saying they're not ready? Because the kids who are experiencing it are ready. So it's like we're trying to maybe protect some sort of innocence of the people who aren't experiencing it. My experience has been, have any of you ever seen, I'm kind of aging myself with this, have any of you ever seen the film It's Elementary? It was a documentary made in I think the 90s. I didn't watch any some of you might not even been born yet, but kind of aging myself here. Okay, well, late 90s, okay? It was made in the late 90s. So it's this documentary where the filmmakers followed around a group of elementary and middle school teachers who were teaching about homophobia in their classes. Elementary and middle school teachers. Well, the most interesting thing about it was the kids who were the most open in that conversation by far were the kindergartners. They could not figure out what the problem was. There was this really cute scene where one of the kids is saying, like, so you're gay, so what's the big whoop, he says. I don't get what the problem is here. The kids who were the most resistant to it were the 8th graders. The oldest kids were resistant to it. I was like, this is such a good metaphor, because I think a lot of what holds us up is our hang-ups about it, more so than the kids. The kids can, we got to talk. I wouldn't go into a kindergarten room and say, institutionalized racism, talk amongst yourself, that sort of thing. But, they know that's not fair. Young kids have a real sense of justice. Y'all know this. That's not fair, that sort of thing. So I think, so I just wanted to start just with this reflection that I think sometimes we might think if we're working with younger kids that this isn't as relevant or that we need the softest version of this. We could celebrate diversity and do some soft, fluffy things, but really the equity thing that doesn't relate to what we're doing with these younger kids. And part of what Baldwin's saying is we got to pick up our pace, and part of that is we got to start earlier. We got to start earlier. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this session, but we're going to start this conversation with digging a little deeper. I kept saying, let's get in touch with our own biases. What are things that we might be doing that we don't even recognize we're doing? So I thought, well, maybe I better unpack that a little bit more and give you all a chance to reflect on that. So we're just going to talk about stereotypes of biases, where do they come from, and then we'll do a little exercise about them, and I'll share a couple stories. So a couple sort of baseline understandings. One is that totally human nature to have biases. Doesn't make any of us evil people. Everybody's got bias. We're all socialized with bias. Families, coaches, teachers, the media, they come from all over the place, right? So we all have biases. We all have limited perspectives due to our stereotypes. Does not make us bad people because we all have that. I mean, I might say if I know that I have one of those and I'm choosing not to do anything about it despite knowing I have it, then maybe I'm a bad person. Okay, maybe I'm not a bad person, maybe I'm just in process person, right? But I don't think we need to feel guilty about having biases. Everyone has biases. We just need to identify them and work on them. The second baseline understanding is that the only way to really address these is to own them, to look at them purposefully. And I want to, part of what I try to do in my career and my work around this is kind of flip the conversation about it. Because I think part of what people might be afraid of is, well, if I admit to struggling with this bias about gay people or about Mexican Americans or about whoever it is, then people are going to think I'm a bigot or I'm a bad person. And I want to flip that, especially for educators, and say that it actually makes you a better educator not to have the bias, but to name the bias and to own the bias and to work on the bias. That should be seen as a triumph. We should be celebrating every moment we're willing to spend doing that, because there are a lot of people who aren't willing to spend any time doing that. There are people who defend the most ludicrous stereotypes, the most ludicrous biases, not even open to a conversation about them. Right? So I want to look at that differently. I want it to feel good having this conversation. Like, this is a triumph. We are badasses because we're willing to have this conversation, and it's going to make us better educators, and other people are not willing to have this conversation. I can't believe I just said badasses, but I meant it, but I should have used my thesaurus on that one and come up with something that's not a curse word. So the third understanding is this is not going to work if we get hung up on guilt or shame, or we're just stuck in some sort of ideology. I mean, one thing I should also say is, there's so much. Part of, I think, what creates a lot of tension around this is just this political moment where it's like people are just so stuck in their ideologies. No matter where I am on the political spectrum, people are stuck in their ideologies and often refuse to just listen to anything that's outside of this narrow little perspective. Everyone from political left to the political right, it seems like so many people are sort of stuck there. It's like, I wouldn't want children to learn that way. There's one narrow way to look at the world, so we're just going to learn that one narrow way to look at the world. Right? So I got to make sure that I'm not doing that, and that sort of relates to this whole bias stereotype thing. So stereotypes basically, and I'm going to ask you all for some examples of this, but there are basically two components, two sort of mental mechanisms that create stereotypes and inform biases. One is called selective evidence gathering. Some of you have probably heard the term confirmation bias. That's the same thing. And the other one is called in-group favor. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I see these operating in schools and with educators, and maybe ask you all for some examples of them as well. So let's start with selective evidence gathering. I'm going to tell you a story about my father. I've written about this story before, but when I wrote about it in my book, I think I said it was my cousin or my friend, because I was afraid my dad would read the book, even though he's never read anything that I've written. You could tell I need some counseling about that issue. But this is a story about my dad. My dad. How many of you, do any of you have road rage issues? Anyone here have road rage issues? Okay. You seem proud of it. That's weird. A little bit, okay. Sometimes it's like the people who look like the calmest, most, mindful, embraced people who actually end up having the road rage. But my dad's got some pretty serious road rage issues. But one thing I would notice growing up about how his road rage operated is that it would operate differently depending on the gender of the person he was pointing his road rage at. So let's say we're driving and a male driver cuts him off. My dad's word of choice was jackass. Jackass. And now I'm kind of freaking out because I used a version of jackass a little earlier, so I must be becoming my father. His word of choice was jackass. if a woman cut him off or did something to ignite his road rage, his response was always different. It was women drivers. Women drivers. Now, if a man cut him off, he's not going to be like men drivers, because then he's one of the jackasses, right? He's not going to, a male driver is his own person. A woman driver is a representative of all women drivers. Right? That is an example of sort of this selective evidence gathering or confirmation bias. I'm starting with this stereotype that women are bad. By the way, let's just nip this stereotype in the bud. Why do you all think that car insurance is cheaper for women than it is for men? Anybody have an idea? Because women are actually better drivers than men. Based on most measures, women get in fewer accidents than men based on a proportion of time on the road. When women get in accidents, they're less likely to be the cause of accidents. So we know by virtually every measure women are better drivers than men. So how does a stereotype survive about that? Right? And as people always say, there's a hint of truth in every stereotype. In this case, there's no hint of truth. There's no hint of truth. It's just a privileged perspective. Okay. So we tend to easily notice evidence that confirms our existing stereotypes. We tend to block out evidence that challenges our stereotypes. And again, just think about the way people take in media. If I choose to do so, I could choose virtually any information source, any source through which I'm being informed. I could choose one that aligns with my existing ideological or political perspective. I could do that. Most people do that, actually. And that's that sort of, I want information that confirms my existing viewpoint. I'm going to avoid information that confronts my viewpoint. Again, terrible way to go through life if you want to be an informed, intelligent person, but most people do that. Okay. So what does that look like in a school? I've had a lot of, the two examples that are just popping in my mind right now. One is, I often hear this sort of thing from teachers. I hear something like, and again, not bigoted, mean, nasty teachers, but just teachers who are trying to figure this out. Oftentimes I'll talk about this and then it's like the what about game. Because what about? I want to come up with an example that confirms my existing stereotype, so I'm going to keep what abouting you until I can come up with that and you can confirm my stereotype. What about the kids who are using the free lunch program and their families are experiencing poverty and then they come to school and they got Air Jordans on? Doesn't that prove that they're irresponsible, that those families are irresponsible with money? When they talk about parents, it's usually phones. It's like, well, this parent, is using these services as though they're poor, but then they come to school and they have a smartphone. And doesn't that prove? I just think that's weird. It's like, that's what a phone is now. That's a phone. That's what people use as phones. It's like you're expecting someone to carry around an old rotary phone, that you got to dial like this. That's what a phone is. It's very odd. But so, what about these kids who are on the free lunch program? I know right now, I think y'all are giving everybody free lunch, but on the free lunch program has got these new Nikes on. Or my only two references to style are Air Jordans and starter jackets. So again, I'm stuck in the 1990s here. Jordache jeans, if we want to go back another decade, but and it's that sort of what about? And again, it's like part of what's happening there is kids are walking through the school. There are kids coming from poverty who have, Kmart shoes on or whatever, cheap shoes, completely invisible to me, but I really notice the ones that ignite my stereotype. I really notice those. And this is an implicit thing that happens. This isn't conscious. This isn't a bunch of rabidly oppressive people. This is just you and me. This is just, So I got to learn how to sort of catch myself. Maybe you've had that thought, maybe something similar to that. Let's do this exercise. Let's say you do have a kid whose family is really deep in poverty and they show up to school and they have Air Jordans on. What is a possible explanation for that other than that family's irresponsible? It was a gift? Okay. Okay. So maybe it's a gift. Maybe I just have a little bit of money right now, and yeah. Maybe they've been saving. Maybe the kid really wanted them. Maybe, maybe they're tired of seeing their kid, hurt because other kids are picking on them for whatever shoes they have. Maybe I can give my kid one nice thing. It could be thrift store. It could be hand-me-downs. They could maybe not even be real Air Jordans. They could be mock Air Jordans. There's a lot of possibilities for what it is. So, but again, if I'm stuck in this sort of confirmation bias, it wouldn't even occur to me that there could be other explanations for this. And that's what we got to catch ourselves on. That's what we got to catch ourselves on. That's selective evidence gathering. The other component of a stereotype is what's called in-group favor. In-group favor means that we tend to think of our own groups as being very diverse. But we tend to think of people in other identity groups as being monolithic, as being all the same. So I can go back to this example with my dad my dad didn't want to be lumped in with all men who are doing crazy things on the road, right? But all women are bad drivers. That's the mechanism that's happening there, in group favor. We tend to think of our own groups as very diverse. Don't lump me in with all those other white people. I'm not like all other white people. But I'll give you an example of how something like this might operate. I don't know. There's a bunch of different examples, but the one that just popped in my head was actually like an example from higher ed, because one of my friends is studying this right now. He's doing this study where he's looking at the sort of ideologies of professors and how they interpret behaviors of students differently across race. So one of the things he's looking at is tardies, because there's this stereotype in higher ed that black students tend to be late to class more often than white students that have different values around time or whatever. So they do this study. They go and observe who's coming on time, who's coming late. They calculate it. What they find, they ask faculty members about their perception, and most faculty members say, yes, black students definitely more likely to show up late than white students in my class, and especially white faculty members. So they collect all the data, and what they find was that even if faculty members had that perception, it actually wasn't true. White students were just as likely to show up late as black students. But they had the perception that this was happening, even though it wasn't actually true. And what they found that was actually operating was that when a black student was late to class, the faculty member was implicitly attributing that to their race in a way that they wouldn't do with a white student. So a black student shows up late, it's like, oh, black student's always late. Why are my black students always showing up late? They're attributing it implicitly. We're not talking about mean racist people. Implicitly, they're attributing it to their race. When white students showed up late, they weren't like, oh, white students are always late. They didn't attribute it to their race. So they were tricking themselves into seeing something that wasn't even happening. The way that this might operate across race in an elementary school would be something like discipline. There are studies that are starting to show that the primary reason why across the country there are discipline disparities across race is that we as educators implicitly interpret behaviors differently depending on who's behaving in a particular way. Not doing it on purpose, not out to get anybody, but this has been tracked in a lot of classrooms and schools and basically shows that, especially for subjective kind of behaviors, that teachers tend to see misbehavior more in students of color than they do in white students who are behaving exactly the same as those students of color. They've done a bunch of tests on this, watch videos of how different students are behaving, observing in class. Now, not one person in here, if you're doing something like that, is doing it on purpose. Nobody's doing it. I hope you're not doing it on purpose. If you are doing it on purpose, then I would humbly suggest a different career other than teaching, if you're doing that on purpose. So I'm presuming none of y'all are doing that on purpose, right? And you might reactively think, I don't think I'm doing that at all. You might think, and maybe some of you aren't doing it at all. But research suggests if you have racial diversity in your school or classroom, you might be doing it just a little bit. And all it takes is the accumulative impact of a lot of teachers doing that a tiny little bit to create a big inequity. So I'm not saying you're doing it. I'm just saying, let's be reflective about it. There's a possibility that something might be operating there that I'm not even trying to allow it to operate. I think about, one of my colleagues used this other example. It's not a school example, but they're like, I go to a restaurant, I'm sitting at a table, and next to me is a table of African American people who are loud and boisterous, and celebrating something. And I might look at that and say, well, yeah, African American people tend to be loud and boisterous. But if I'm at a restaurant and there's a white group of people, so I'm attributing it to their race. If there's a white group of people being loud and boisterous, as a white person, I don't look at that and say, yeah, white people tend to be boisterous. It's just that table of white people is being boisterous. But I'm not attributing it to an entire race. So we got to look at how this stuff operates in us. We got to have the humility to say, none of us want it to operate. Let's look at how it's operating. I just wanted to throw this up here because this term implicit bias is just really popular right now. And everyone's talking about implicit bias, and there are some people who are arguing that there's no such thing as implicit bias, but there's a lot of research that there is implicit bias. Explicit bias are the biases to which we ascribe consciously. So you're saying, okay, I choose to be sexist, I choose to be homophobic. I know that I have these presumptions and I choose to hold on to them, however ridiculous they might be. Implicit bias is happening mostly without us even realizing it's happening. And to me, that's the scarier thing, because all of us really well-intended people, are participating through these implicit biases. I talked a lot about that earlier. So again, it's just about how can I identify when these old tapes are playing in my head. So here's the exercise I want you to do. And I say free right up here, but actually what I'd love for you all to do is just get into groups and have a couple conversations. Conversation one is, I want you to maybe get in groups of 3, so each person will hear 2 other stories. Think about a time a teacher or somebody else exhibited a stereotype about you. Some kind of bias or stereotype. Maybe it had to do with something like race or class or gender, but it could have had to do with something completely different. Stereotype about me as an athlete, or stereotype about me as someone who's in drama stuff, or it doesn't have to be about one of these identity sorts of things necessarily. But what is a time someone exhibited a stereotype about you, and how did it affect you? So I want you to talk about that. But then I want you to practice this little ownership thing. What is a time you exhibited a bias or stereotype about somebody else? It doesn't have to be a big I was running through the hallway screaming the N-word. We're not talking about something big like that. It could just be something subtle. But what I want the story about is a bias you had, and you learned to recognize it as a bias, and you realized, ooh, I better do something. I'm misinformed about this. I better learn how to understand this a little better. So the story here is the triumph story. I had this bias. I overcame the bias. What did that look like? Okay, so what is a bias somebody had about you? What is a bias you had about someone else? How did you overcome that bias? Okay, so what do we have until 10:45? Okay, so I'm going to give you, oh boy. I want to give you 10 minutes, but I don't think I have time to give you 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you, it really doesn't matter because I never time these things, so I could say anything right now. I'm going to give you 6 minutes and 24 seconds and not 1 second more to have this conversation. Groups of 2 or 3 will be fine. And then we'll come back and process a little bit. miss the elementary school photos. Active now that they're by themselves without the. Oh, really? What do you think? Why do you think that is? Maybe as soon as I leave, you'll get the question. Take about 90 more seconds. 90 more seconds, and we'll pull it back together. All right, just take another 15 seconds to wrap those up, and then we'll pull it back together. All right. I would love it if maybe just two people would share their story of a time you recognize that maybe you were struggling with a little bias and you overcame the bias, or at least worked to overcome it. Is anybody willing to share that story? A story like that? Did anybody hear a story like that from somebody and you want to just encourage them to share it? Awesome, thank you. I'm going to give you the mic so that.
We were talking about how here in Johnson Creek we have a lot of like socioeconomic diversity, and how sometimes I'll be like, oh, why is this kid not getting support at home? And I'll like look them up on Skyward and see their address is like the trailer park. And then I instantly have this new, like, oh, this is exactly why they're not getting support at home. So like just where they live kind of thing.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share? Oh, okay.
Hello. I guess to go off of that, I get it, but also in my perspective, it's the cultural thing where parents aren't comfortable with that and they don't want to be here, they don't want to do that stuff. So they leave it up to me or someone else. Hey, can you tell the teacher this instead? Or I'm too embarrassed to go. So it's sometimes not where they live or things like that. It's the culture. They don't do those things. They don't believe in dress-up days or other things like that. So it's I guess, win-lose situations. If you don't know, I don't even know them all, but that's a lot of it is they're just not comfortable coming in or they don't want to. It's not that they don't like you guys. They just don't want to. And I'm the one that gets the text messages saying, oh, can you tell so-and-so they're not coming today? I'm like, well, you should call the office. But I'm the office now for a lot of parents, so. And that's just what it is. It's just growing up that way, knowing my parents were the same way. They just, if I didn't go to school, they didn't call. It was just like, school knows you're not going. I don't know how to explain it. So.
I mean, I think this point about different cultures is really important because there are some families who just part of cultural values is we are going to defer to the teachers. The teachers know what they're doing. The schools, they're professionals. We're not going to we don't need to get, to that sort of thing. I think for us, the thing is, how am I interpreting that? Am I interpreting that as a disinterest in education itself? Am I interpreting that as you were saying, just a cultural difference that it might be? Again, I mean, people have studied this across race, across class, across everything, and come to the conclusion that generally the problem is not that somebody isn't valuing education. It's almost always something else. It's not that we're not valuing it. I could tell you about around the class and poverty stuff because the research is very clear about that. Generally, when people have asked parents, done research where they've asked parents, well, why are you less likely to visit your kid's school or whatever it is? There's two buckets of reasons. One bucket is basically just access. Work multiple jobs. Think about paid leave as a resource. Like, I can take a couple hours, but if I have to miss work for that couple hours, I'm still going to get paid. Well, people in low-income families, that's not the kinds of jobs they tend to have. They tend to have jobs where they're paid hourly, so if they're not there, they're not going to get paid, things like that. So buckets like that, don't have transportation, can't afford childcare, don't have time off of work, whatever. The other bucket might include things like this cultural piece or, sort of about feelings of belonging, like it's not really my place to do that, or sometimes it could be how they've been treated previously, not by you, but by somebody else, or how they were treated when they were students. Like, I don't feel welcome. I don't feel welcome. I don't feel comfortable, going in there and that sort of thing. So good examples. And again, the idea of doing an exercise like this is not to embarrass ourselves or blame ourselves for everything. It's just about getting in touch with something and not just here's something I can do better because it's a bias I have, but here's a pathway out of the bias. Here's a way I've overcome that so that when other biases come up, we can address that. Okay, we're really running behind here, so I'm just going to jump ahead to this. Did you all get all that? Did I go through that too fast? Because I want to give you one sort of practical thing. So there's this thing that we call phases of like multicultural curriculum or equity curriculum. This kind of, it's already embedded in what we've sort of already talked about, but the reason why I think this is so important for a group of elementary educators is, again, I think the tendency is to think because our students are so young, the best we could do in terms of our instruction and curriculum is celebrate diversity. That's about as far as we can go. That's what these kids can handle. And I just want to urge you to think about they can handle more than that. In fact, the ones who are already experiencing bias and inequity, they're already handling more than that. But the thing is that, again, like from this movie, It's Elementary, from my observations, the kids you're working with are actually going to be more open to talking about some of these issues than kids in high schools who already have their biases are already set. They've already been socialized and conditioned to believe certain things in the media and all that, and they're set. So the question is, how can you engage them in conversations about things like racism or poverty or those sorts of things. So we talk about these 4 phases. The first phase is called diversity appreciation. This is sort of the fluffy phase. Emphasis on surface level cultural celebrations. Yeah. Last slide. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know in my career I thought about that sort of thing. I mean, that's part of why earlier I was saying that part of this is a leadership thing and who's going to have your back if you do this and then a parent complains. I mean, right now, parents are organizing, they're resistant to organizing around resistance to anything that has anything to do with any of this. There's some of that going on. And so it's kind of a precarious time in a way to be talking about all this stuff. So, all we could do is say, here's my sphere of influence, here's what I'm able to do, and here are the things I need to balance. So in the context of what I need to balance, without creating hostility for myself, what is the closest I can get? What is the furthest along I can go? And we all just have to decide that for ourselves. I think it's a really important point. And I think there's definitely recently been a sort of an uptick in that. So it's tough. It's tough, yeah. I mean, even in my work, I'm dealing with that. I got all kinds of people after me. I don't know. So again, everyone's just got to make a decision about this. But and just to clarify one thing, my point is not that I don't think that adults are ready to have the conversation. I think more of it is sort of kind of similar along the lines that you are. That we might, my point was more that we might think that young kids aren't ready for it, when kids are ready for it, even if the community is going to have all kinds of blowback about it. So diversity appreciation, surface level cultural celebrations of diversity. Some of you might even get blowback about that. It's just kind of what's happening right now. I remember when I was, big thing when I was in elementary school to learn about indigenous communities is they would ask families to donate Quaker oatmeal canisters. And we would make drums out of Quaker oatmeal canisters to learn. That's this sort of thing, right? As a kid, I was always like, I never knew Native Americans ate so much oatmeal. I was kind of confused about what we were doing in that exercise. But diversity appreciation. So we should be doing diversity appreciation. I'm just saying we want to get sort of past that. So then there's what we call representational inclusion. It's a way too academic term for what it actually is. Representational inclusion says, well, here's the diversity I have in my class. I want to make sure that the curriculum is inclusive of the diversity in my class. So I better, in my book collection, I got a kid this year who has 2 moms, so maybe I need to have a book about that. You might get blowback about that. Leadership, got to have their back in case I get blowback about that. but it's just about being representative. So it's just a sort of little inclusion, and this is getting us a little bit closer to what we want. The third phase is called transformative inclusion. This is where the curriculum is reshaped so that diverse perspectives are woven into it, instead of like, here's the main perspective, here's the alternative perspective. But everything's sort of woven in. And this is getting us a little closer. But what I want to challenge you to, even if you're going to be up against all kinds of resistance and you can only do it in small ways, to just think about transformative inclusion. How can I make sure to be inclusive in a serious way, not just a tokenistic way? But also, when it's appropriate in the curriculum, having conversations about these issues in the classroom. It doesn't mean I'm going to stop teaching about math and only teach about diversity. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when it's, I was working with, in this one school, in the, talked with a fourth grade teacher. And the fourth grade teacher had been trying to come up with, there was a lot of poverty in the district, and the fourth grade teacher was like, I have a lot of kids who are experiencing poverty, and they know that's going on, and they don't understand why we're never talking about that in school. So I came up, he was like, I was trying to come up with this interdisciplinary activity for them to do, and what he came up with was, he put his students in groups, and I can't remember what he was teaching about math at the time, but the challenge he gave them was a pretty advanced challenge. I thought it was pretty interesting. He said, what I want you to do is, I want you to go and interview your parents, other people about different expenses and costs, and I want each group to calculate what a living wage would be here. What would a living wage be in our community? He did that with fourth graders. Now, they were pretty far off in their estimates, the fourth graders, but it was a way into the conversation, and he's teaching math. He's teaching applied math there. That's a great example of something like that. So we don't have to manufacture stuff. It could just be in the course of what we're teaching when it's appropriate to wrap it in. Okay, so. Okay, the question was how to do this in the context where you might have resistant parents, like the ones who are all up in arms about critical race theory and all that sort of thing. That's sort of related to kind of what we were just talking about. I would say, I mean, that's a big continuum of people. I think there are some parents who are resistant to it because they just don't understand what it is we're talking about, and I can maybe help them understand. There are some groups who it does not matter how I frame it, what kind of bow I tie on it, they're just ideologically opposed to any of it, and there's nothing I can do about that. There's no energy I can spend on that that's going to make that better. So I would say don't spend energy on that, but maybe engage with the parents who are resistant but at least open to the conversation about why would we be having students calculate a living wage in their community. So part of it is about that, but part of it, again, I think of this is really on leadership, because if you do any version of this, then you risk having some blowback. And then the question is, well, who's got your back when you have blowback? And leadership's got to be strong with that. And leadership's got to be willing, when a parent comes in and says, well, this is a bunch of BS, I don't want my student learning about race, somebody's got to be able to say, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me. And we feel like if there's any bias or inequity festering here, it is harmful to all kids. So what we're committed to is eliminating any of the bias and the inequity, and we promise we care just as much about your kid as any other kid. It's not going to be an anti-white people thing. It's not going to be an anti-middle class people thing, but it is going to be an honest thing. And you know, this is, thank you, but this is what we're committed to, and this is what we're doing. I think But I do think in this day and age, that is something we do have to take into consideration, which maybe a couple years ago we might not have had to take into consideration. Okay, I know we're basically out of time here. So just really quickly, I promised I would get to hit some practical points. We already talked about this, reflect on our own bias, of course, reimagine curriculum and instruction. So if you can move from an approach which is, how can I make this just a little more inclusive, to thinking a little bigger. Like, how can I reimagine this lesson plan? You don't have to reimagine the whole thing at once. Let's just start with a lesson plan. How can I reimagine this from an equity point of view? I learn how to do it, and then it just becomes natural. So now when I'm lesson planning, I'm just naturally applying that lens. Reconsider school and classroom policies. We talked about that. Look at your homework policy. Look at tardy policies. Look at any other policies and just ask yourself, are they being applied equitably? Are we considering the existing context of inequity? Finally, this goes back to a question someone asked earlier. If you want to know what the challenges and barriers are, ask people who are marginalized members of the community. But if you're going to ask them, believe what they say. Ask them and believe what they say. If you want to know, a school is as equitable as the most marginalized people experience that school to be. So go to them, ask what's going on here for you. Families, what's going on here for you. Believe what they say and be willing to adjust based on what they say. Again, you don't have to do the whole thing at once. You can take it in slices. That's perfectly legitimate. But do something. Do something. So thank you all. Sorry I went a little over time here. I just want to end by saying, I know the last year and a half or so has been really tough time to be an educator. I just feel like it's going to get me to tear up here a little bit. I just feel this camaraderie with fellow educators right now. I've always felt that, but I feel it's stronger now than I've ever felt. And so I just want to thank you all for what you do for kids, especially in a time when it's always hard to be a teacher, but it's been tougher, I think, for many of us. And I think y'all don't hear thank you enough, so I'm saying it. Thank you for what y'all are doing. So I guess it's time for the next session. So enjoy whatever you all are doing next.